Have you ever noticed something about a child that made your stomach drop? I've been driving school buses for 12 years, meaning I've seen every type of kid possible. But Lacey was different from the moment she stepped onto my bus 3 months ago. She was 10 years old, always perfectly dressed, sitting in the same seat behind my mirror where I could see everything. Her Aunt Sharon picked her up every day at 3:20, always wearing sunglasses, always in a different car, which seemed odd, but I figured maybe she worked at a dealership or something. Lacey would say, "Good morning, Mr. Pete, and have a nice day, Mr. Pete," with this bright smile, always chattering about her little brother Tommy, who was in a wheelchair. The first really strange thing I noticed was the transformation that happened every day at exactly 3:15. Lacey would pack up her homework, pull out a small mirror, and start this whole routine, fixing her hair into these intricate braids, spraying herself with heavy perfume that smelled like vanilla and lavender. "I have to look pretty for my modeling job," she'd announce proudly. "Aunt Sharon says I'm so good at it that Tommy gets all his medicine because of me." Then she'd practice poses in her little mirror, duck faces and winks that looked disturbing on a 10-year-old's face. When we'd pull up to her stop and she'd see that car, always different, always with tinted windows, she'd bounce excitedly. "Look, Mr. Pete, more producers. Aunt Sharon says I'm getting famous." The aunt would be standing there, arms crossed, and Lacey would run to her, chattering about her day. But Sharon never smiled, just grabbed Lacey's shoulder and steered her to the car, checking her appearance like she was inspecting merchandise. Things escalated over the next few weeks in ways that slowly made me realize something was very wrong. Lacey started bringing a second backpack on Mondays, keeping it tucked under her seat. "It's my modeling supplies," she told me proudly. Aunt Sharon says professional models bring their own stuff. One Tuesday, she got on wearing the same clothes as Monday, moving stiffly. "We had a really long photo shoot," she explained brightly. "Sometimes they go all night, but guess what? Tommy's getting his new leg braces next week." She pulled out makeup to cover dark circles, chattering about how the cameras need lots of takes to get it perfect. She started taking pills every morning, vitamins for energy, she called them. The producers give them to all the models. Once she showed me her money, so proud. "Look, Mr. Pete, $500, all for Tommy. Aunt Sharon says if I do extra shoots this week, Tommy might even get his special surgery." That Thursday morning changed everything. Lacey struggled onto my bus with her regular backpack and a duffel bag, breathless with excitement. "Big shoot today. Aunt Sharon says it's the most important one ever." When I helped her lift the bag, her backpack fell open, and I saw inside lingerie and plastic bags, items that made my blood freeze. Things that finally made all the pieces click into place. Lacey didn't notice my shock, just kept babbling happily. "The producers say I'm their favorite model. They bring special cameras just for me. And if today goes well, Tommy gets to go to that special hospital in California." Throughout the ride, she kept checking her phone, reading texts aloud. "Aunt Sharon says to remember my special poses." And she says the men today are super important producers from Hollywood. At 3:15, she changed into a sequined dress in the back of the bus, so proud of how grown up she looked. "Don't I look like a real movie star, Mr. Pete?" she asked, twirling. My stomach was in my throat. At her stop, there were 4 cars waiting. Sharon was there with 3 men I'd never seen before. Lacey squealed with delight. "Look how many there are." Aunt Sharon said if I'm extra good today, Tommy gets his wheelchair and his surgery. One man was holding professional camera equipment. Another had a thick manila envelope that Sharon took counting bills. Lacey waved at me happily as she skipped to the car. "Bye, Mr. Pete. Wish me luck." Sharon grabbed her roughly, and I heard her say something about premium clients and remember what we practiced. Lacey nodded eagerly. "I know all my poses by heart." That's when I knew this wasn't just abuse. I abandoned my route, told dispatch I had engine trouble, and followed that SUV. They didn't go to any photo studio. They went to the industrial district, to the Starlight Motel. 3 more cars were waiting at room 118. Men got out carrying lighting equipment and black cases. Lacey practically bounced to the door, turning back to wave at someone, calling out, "I love you, Tommy." That innocent joy, that complete unawareness of the danger. That's when I called 911 and told them about the trafficking, about what I saw in Lacey's backpack that morning. The dispatcher's voice stayed steady in my ear while I watched that motel door, my hands shaking so bad I had to grip the steering wheel to keep the phone still. I rattled off license plates as fast as I could see them. A black SUV with Texas plates, a silver sedan from Oklahoma, describing the men I'd seen going in, one tall and thin with a baseball cap, another heavy-set wearing a leather jacket, the camera equipment they carried looking expensive and professional. My voice cracked when I told her about the timeline, how they'd been inside for 12 minutes already, and she kept asking me to repeat details while typing fast on her end. The dispatcher told me units were already rolling and asked about immediate danger, how many people I thought were inside. And I counted out loud. Sharon plus the 3 men I saw enter, plus whoever was already waiting meant at least 7 adults and 1 child. I mentioned the camera equipment again, the black cases that looked like they held lights or other gear, and she said something to someone else on her end about expediting the response. 2 police cars pulled into the motel lot exactly 8 minutes later with no sirens, but moving fast, and the officers got out looking alert and ready. They came straight to my bus first, and I rolled down the window, showing them the photos I'd managed to take on my phone of the vehicles and the men entering the room. The first officer, a young guy with intense eyes, asked me to explain everything I'd witnessed, and I rushed through the story about Lacey's backpack that morning, the items I'd seen, how I'd followed them here. More units started arriving, including an unmarked car that pulled up right beside me, and out stepped a woman in a suit who moved with complete authority. Detective Sylvia Bellamy introduced herself quickly and started firing questions at me about Lacey's routine. When I first noticed problems, what specific behaviors had changed over the past 3 months. I told her about the Monday backpacks, the pills Lacey called vitamins, the money she'd shown me, the different cars every day, while she took notes and radioed information to the other officers. The uniformed cops were gathering near the motel office while Bellamy called for backup and specifically requested a CPS worker, explaining to someone that they had a child victim who probably didn't understand she needed help. She turned back to me and said they had to move carefully because Lacey might panic or try to protect Sharon if they went in too aggressive. The officers formed up outside room 118 and knocked firmly, announcing themselves as police conducting a welfare check on a minor their child. They knocked again, louder this time, identifying themselves clearly and asking for the door to be opened, but nobody answered even after 3 attempts. The motel manager appeared with a key card, a nervous older man who kept wiping his hands on his pants, and handed it to the lead officer, who swiped it and pushed the door open. Shouting erupted immediately from inside, men's voices yelling over each other, Sharon screaming something about permits and legal photo shoots, and Bellamy grabbed my arm to keep me back by the police cars. The waiting felt endless as more shouting came from the room, furniture scraping, what sounded like people running, and I kept picturing what they must be finding in there. A female officer emerged carrying Lacey wrapped in a police blanket, the girl looking confused and asking where Aunt Sharon was, why she couldn't finish her photo shoot. Lacey kept insisting she needed to go back inside because the producers were waiting and Tommy needed his surgery money, not understanding why everyone looked so serious. The officer placed her gently in a squad car while Lacey pressed against the window, still calling for Sharon and saying she'd been really good at her poses. Sharon came out next in handcuffs, screaming about lawyers and constitutional rights, claiming this was all a huge misunderstanding and she had contracts to prove everything was legal. 2 men were also brought out cuffed, one of them the heavy-set guy in the leather jacket, while officers reported that 3 others had apparently escaped through the bathroom window. Sharon kept yelling that she was just helping her niece with legitimate modeling work, that she had signed releases, that they were ruining a little girl's career. A van pulled up and CPS worker Rada Walker got out, moving straight to the squad car where Lacey was sitting, and knelt down to talk to her through the open door. Rada spoke softly to Lacey, who immediately started asking about Tommy, saying he needed his medicine and his wheelchair and couldn't they just let her finish the photo shoot so he could get his surgery. Rada promised they would make sure Tommy was safe and taken care of, that right now they just wanted to help Lacey, but the girl kept insisting she wasn't hurt and didn't need help. The police were photographing everything in the motel room while crime scene tape went up, and I could see camera equipment being carried out in evidence bags along with computers and cell phones. There's something deeply unsettling about how Lacey talks about her modeling job with such genuine excitement, while Mr. Pete is clearly piecing together a much darker reality. The way she keeps mentioning Tommy and his medical needs makes me wonder if Sharon is using the sick brother story to manipulate this poor kid into thinking she's helping her family. Detective Bellamy came back to me and said they'd need my full statement at the station, but for now I should know I'd done the right thing, that I'd saved that little girl's life. Rada told me they needed to take Lacey to the hospital right away for a medical exam and asked if I could come along since Lacey seemed to trust me. We drove to the county hospital in separate cars with Lacey still wrapped in that police blanket, asking why she couldn't just go home to check on Tommy. The emergency room was busy, but they took us straight back to a special area I'd never seen before, with softer lighting and pictures of nature on the walls. A nurse named Vivian Whitehead met us there wearing regular clothes instead of scrubs, which seemed to help Lacey relax a little bit. Vivian explained she was going to do a special checkup to make sure Lacey was healthy, and Lacey kept insisting she felt fine and didn't need any doctors. "I earned $800 today for Tommy's surgery," she announced proudly, while Vivian carefully documented everything Lacey said. The exam took over 2 hours with Vivian being incredibly patient as Lacey talked about all the different photo shoots and how the producers always said she was their best model. Rada stayed with Lacey the whole time while I waited in the hallway, feeling sick about what that poor kid had been through without even knowing it. Detective Bellamy came by to check on the progress and told me they'd arrested 5 men total, though 3 others had gotten away before police arrived. She said the evidence in that motel room was going to put these guys away for a long time, but first they needed to figure out how big this operation really was. Around 9 that night, my phone rang, and it was my supervisor, Ernest Hayden, calling to tell me I was suspended pending an investigation into abandoning my route. He said parents had been calling all afternoon, complaining that their kids had to wait over an hour for another driver to pick them up. I told him I'd had an emergency situation with a child in danger, but he said proper protocol was to call dispatch first and let them handle it. The suspension was effective immediately, which meant no pay until the investigation was complete, and possibly losing my job permanently if they decided I'd violated policy. I'd expected this might happen, but it still hurt knowing I might lose everything for doing what I knew was right. Ernest said there would be a hearing in 2 weeks where I could explain my side, but for now, I needed to turn in my keys and stay away from all district property. The next morning, Detective Bellamy called to tell me Sharon had hired some expensive lawyer who was already making noise about illegal searches and kidnapping charges against the police. The lawyer was claiming Sharon was just a desperate aunt trying to pay medical bills through legitimate modeling work and that the police had traumatized an innocent child. Bellamy said this was typical defense strategy in trafficking cases and rarely worked once all the evidence came out, but it meant things were going to get complicated. She asked me to come to the station to give a more detailed statement about everything I'd observed over the past 3 months. Meanwhile, the crime scene team had been working all night at the Starlight Motel, documenting everything they found in room 118. They recovered multiple cameras, including hidden ones in the ceiling, professional lighting equipment, and a ledger with coded entries that appeared to be client names and payment amounts. There were envelopes of cash totaling over $20,000 and receipts for equipment purchases going back months. The forensics team also found DNA evidence on the bedding and furniture that would help identify everyone who'd been in that room. Detective Bellamy said they'd found similar setups in 2 other rooms that had been cleaned out recently, but still had trace evidence. That afternoon, I met with Assistant District Attorney Keith Dubois, who was taking lead on the prosecution. He was a tall, thin man with gray hair who spoke very quietly, but you could tell he was furious about what had happened to Lacey. Keith said he was getting emergency warrants for all the phones and computers they'd seized from the motel and Sharon's car. He told me this case was already bigger than just Sharon and Lacey, based on preliminary evidence suggesting a multi-state trafficking ring. The warrants would let them access encrypted files and deleted messages that might lead to other victims and higher-level organizers. Keith warned me I'd probably need to testify multiple times as the case developed and asked if I was prepared for that kind of commitment. I spent the next 4 hours at the police station giving my formal statement with Detective Bellamy recording everything. She had me go through every single day I could could remember starting from when Lacey first got on my bus 3 months ago. I wrote down dates when I noticed her behavior changing, like when she started bringing that second backpack and when she began taking those pills. We made a timeline of all the different cars that picked her up, and I described every detail I could remember about Sharon's behavior. The detective had me draw a diagram of my bus route and mark exactly where Lacey got on and off each day. She asked about any other adults I'd seen with Lacey and whether I'd ever noticed bruises or injuries. By the time we finished, my hand was cramping from writing and my throat was dry from talking, but Bellamy said my observations were going to be crucial for the case. The tech team started working on the seized electronics that night, pulling data from multiple phones and 2 laptops. They found hundreds of text messages with what looked like grooming scripts, telling Sharon exactly what to say to keep Lacey cooperating. There were burner phone numbers linking to other cities and references to someone called the banker, who seemed to be running the financial side. The computers had encrypted folders with photos and videos that made the investigators sick but would serve as undeniable evidence. Most disturbing were the messages showing Sharon was getting detailed instructions from someone higher up about which clients to schedule and how much to charge. The operation was clearly much bigger than just one woman exploiting her niece for money. Rada called me that evening to update me on Lacey's situation and to schedule a forensic interview with a specialist. She explained that the specialist knew how to talk to trafficked children in ways that wouldn't cause more trauma but could help build the legal case. Rada warned me that Lacey still completely believed she'd been helping Tommy, and it would take months or maybe years of therapy for her to understand what really happened. The interview was scheduled for next week, and they hoped Lacey might provide details about other children she'd seen at these photo shoots, since the evidence suggested she wasn't the only victim. That same day, parents from my regular route started calling the bus company to complain about me abandoning their kids without warning. Some were angry their children had to wait in the cold, while others were upset they had to leave work early when the kids didn't come home on time. The district was getting dozens of calls demanding I be fired immediately for putting children at risk. My union representative, Russell Pace, called to say he was stepping in to defend me, but warned the pressure was intense. Russell said the district wanted to make an example of me to show they took safety protocols seriously, even though everyone privately admitted I'd done the right thing. He was preparing a defense based on the emergency exception clause in our contract, but said it would be an uphill battle. The next few days brought more discoveries as Detective Bellamy dug into the motel's records with a warrant from the judge. She found the same room had been booked repeatedly under different fake names, always for just one night at a time. The pattern went back over a year with gaps that suggested they moved locations periodically to avoid suspicion. Credit card records showed payments from dozens of different cards, many of them prepaid or stolen, which made tracing the customers nearly impossible. Most disturbing was that the booking pattern suggested multiple children had been brought to that room long before Lacey became a victim. Bellamy cross-referenced the dates with missing children reports and found 3 possible matches, though none had been recovered yet. The next morning, Detective Bellamy called to say a judge had signed search warrants for Sharon's apartment and vehicle. The team had to move fast before anyone could warn accomplices or destroy evidence. I watched from my bus route as 3 unmarked cars pulled up to Sharon's building around noon. Officers carried out boxes of papers and several computers, while neighbors stood on their stoops watching. They found more burner phones hidden in her closet, along with stacks of cash and shoe boxes. The vehicle search turned up receipts from different motels across 3 states and a notebook with dates and dollar amounts. Meanwhile, Rada had arranged for Lacey's forensic interview with a specialist who knew how to talk to trafficked kids. The interview happened in a room with stuffed animals and soft lighting designed to make children feel safe. Lacey sat on a blue couch playing with a teddy bear, while the specialist asked gentle questions. She described the special poses the men wanted her to do and the games they played with the cameras. She mentioned one man who always wore a big gold ring with a red stone who scared her. She still thought she'd been doing a good job and kept asking if Tommy was getting his surgery. The specialist recorded everything, while Rada took notes behind a 2-way mirror. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about all the warning signs I'd ignored for months. The way Lacey keeps talking about earning money for Tommy, while the nurse documents everything, makes me wonder how deep this lie goes in her mind. How do kids process trauma by turning it into something else entirely? My mind kept replaying every strange comment Lacey had made about her modeling. At 2 in the morning, I called Detective Bellamy's cell phone, asking if they'd found Tommy yet. I was terrified he might be involved in the trafficking somehow, or that Sharon had hurt him. Bellamy told me to calm down and said she was already working on locating him through school records. She found him the next day through the nurse at his elementary school, who had his emergency contact information. Tommy had been staying with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Vargas, while Sharon was supposedly working night shifts. Mrs. Vargas thought Sharon cleaned offices at a medical building downtown and had no idea about the trafficking. She'd been watching Tommy for free because she felt bad about his disability and liked having company. CPS arrived that afternoon to remove Tommy from Mrs. Vargas's apartment despite her protests. They placed him in protective custody at a group home while they assessed his medical needs. His wheelchair and medications turned out to be completely legitimate and paid for by Medicaid. All those stories about needing Lacey's money for his care had been lies Sharon used to manipulate her. Tommy was confused and kept asking for his sister, but the social workers couldn't let them see each other yet. I called Rada to ask if I could send Lacey a note, just letting her know I was thinking about her. She agreed to pass along a simple message that Mr. Pete hoped she was okay and missed seeing her. I wrote on a piece of notebook paper that I was proud of her for being brave. Rada said Lacey smiled when she read it and asked if she could come back on my bus soon. 2 days later, the investigation exploded when fingerprints from the motel room matched a registered sex offender from Nevada. The FBI immediately took over the case since it crossed state lines and involved organized trafficking. Agents showed up at the police station with boxes of files from similar cases in other states. They said this was part of a larger network they'd been tracking for 2 years. The local detectives had to turn over all their evidence, but Bellamy stayed on as a liaison. That weekend, I went out to my car and found a piece of paper under my windshield wiper. It said I should keep my mouth shut if I knew what was good for me. My hands hands shook as I called Detective Bellamy, who told me not to touch anything else. She sent officers to dust for prints and arranged for patrol cars to drive by my house every few hours. The FBI agent said this was common when trafficking rings felt threatened, and not to let it scare me. They installed a security camera on my porch and gave me a special phone number to call if anything else happened. Sharon's lawyer started filing motions the next week, claiming the search had been illegal and the evidence was planted. He argued the police had no probable cause and that Sharon was framed by the real traffickers. ADA Dubois wasn't worried and told me everything had been done by the book with proper warrants. He was building an airtight case for the preliminary hearing with all the physical evidence and witness statements. The lawyer kept trying different angles, but the judge rejected every motion he filed. 3 weeks later, I got a subpoena to testify at Sharon's preliminary hearing scheduled for the following Monday. My stomach churned thinking about seeing her again and having to describe what I'd witnessed. The courthouse was packed with reporters when I arrived, wearing my only suit that felt too tight. I sat in the witness waiting room for 2 hours before they called my name. Walking into that courtroom and seeing Sharon at the defense table made my skin crawl. She stared at me with pure hatred, while her lawyer argued she should be released on bail. Her hair was pulled back and she wore a conservative dress, trying to look like a concerned aunt. The prosecutor asked me to describe everything I'd seen over the 3 months Lacey was on my bus. I went through every detail, from the backpack with the second set of clothes to the pills she took every morning to the way Sharon counted money in that envelope. The judge listened carefully, taking notes while Sharon's lawyer kept objecting about hearsay and speculation. When I finished, the prosecutor asked if I'd ever seen Lacey show signs of physical abuse, and I described how she moved stiffly that Tuesday, how she covered dark circles with makeup. Sharon's lawyer stood up, claiming I was making assumptions about innocent modeling work and that plenty of child actors work long hours. The prosecutor then showed photos from the motel room that made several people in the gallery gasp. The judge called for order, and after 2 more hours of arguments about evidence and probable cause, he finally made his ruling. He denied bail completely, calling Sharon a clear flight risk and danger to the community based on the evidence presented. Several parents in the courtroom started clapping until the bailiff told them to stop. Sharon screamed something about this being a setup before they led her back to holding. 3 days later, Detective Bellamy called with big news. One of the men they arrested at the motel decided to cooperate for a reduced sentence. He gave them names and details about the whole operation, including someone he called the banker, who handled all the money transfers and payments. Bellamy said this guy managed Bitcoin wallets and cash drops for multiple cells across 3 states. The investigation team was working around the clock now that they had a real lead on the financial side. Meanwhile, my union rep Russell finally got somewhere with the school district. After weeks of meetings and paperwork, they negotiated my suspension down to just a written warning and mandatory retraining on emergency protocols. I'd be back driving in 2 weeks on a different route since parents on my old one had mixed feelings about me abandoning their kids that day. Russell said it was the best deal we could get considering I violated multiple policies, even if it was for a good reason. The following week, Rada arranged for Lacey and Tommy to have their first supervised visit since being removed from Sharon's custody. She called me afterward and said it was heartbreaking to watch. Lacey kept apologizing to Tommy for not earning enough money for his surgery, promising she'd work harder next time if they'd let her. Tommy just wanted to play with his sister, but Lacey couldn't stop talking about the modeling jobs and how she'd failed him. Rada said it would take months of therapy to undo the psychological damage Sharon had done. The tech team working on the seized computers finally cracked the encrypted files after bringing in a specialist from the FBI cybercrimes unit. They found payment records going back 2 years with Bitcoin transfers totaling over $3 million. There were spreadsheets with license plates of vehicles used to transport kids to different locations. Photos of at least 20 other children with coded names and client preferences noted next to each one. The network was massive, way bigger than just Sharon's operation. They had hubs in 6 states with different people running each cell. A week later, I got subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury, which meant spending an entire day in a windowless room downtown, answering the same questions over and over. The prosecutor said my testimony was crucial for establishing the timeline since I'd observed Lacey's decline over 3 months. They asked about every detail I could remember, making me go through my written statement line by line. Other witnesses came and went throughout the day, including some parents from the school who'd noticed odd things about Lacey, but never reported anything. The grand jury members looked exhausted by the time I finished. That weekend, I was at the grocery store when a woman approached me in the cereal aisle. She said her daughter had been on my route and mentioned weird things about Lacey that she'd ignored at the time. Her daughter said Lacey showed her pictures of fancy hotel rooms and talked about her producer friends buying her presents. The mom wished she'd paid more attention instead of dismissing it as kid talk. She thanked me quietly and walked away before I could respond. 2 weeks into my new route, Detective Bellamy called about a suspicious vehicle she'd noticed parked near one of my stops 3 days in a row. She had patrol officers run the plates and check out the driver. Turned out it was just a grandfather waiting to pick up his grandson who'd started walking home alone against his parents' wishes, but it showed how paranoid everyone had become since the case broke. Even routine situations seemed threatening now. Bellamy said she'd rather check 100 false alarms than miss one real threat. The FBI executed search warrants at 2 storage units linked to the operation through the financial records. They found more camera equipment, dozens of external hard drives, and boxes of children's clothing in various sizes, still with tags on them. Some of the clothes matched what victims had described wearing during their abuse. The agent in charge told Bellamy this was one of the largest trafficking operations they'd uncovered in the Midwest. They estimated at least 50 children had been victimized over the past 5 years based on the evidence. Meanwhile, Rada was working with Lacey in therapy sessions to help her understand what really happened. She explained that real modeling happens in professional studios with parents present, not in motel rooms. That the money Lacey thought she earned was actually stolen from her by adults who hurt her. That none of it was her fault, and she didn't fail Tommy by not earning enough. Rada said Lacey would cry and insist she was a good model who followed all the rules, that the producers said she was special. The deprogramming process was slow and painful, requiring Lacey to rebuild her entire understanding of what happened to her. Mrs. Vargas watching Tommy for free while Sharon supposedly worked night shifts? That whole setup feels calculated. Using a kind neighbor's good heart as free childcare while running this awful operation seems like exactly the kind of manipulation Sharon would plan out. Detective Bellamy spent the next 3 weeks in the prosecutor's office with stacks of files spread across a conference table. She'd call me in twice to go over specific dates and times while Dubois took notes on his yellow legal pad. They were building what they called a timeline chart with red strings connecting different events and photos from security cameras at the motel. Bellamy showed me photos of the men from that day and asked if I recognized any others who'd picked up Lacey before. She had me circle faces in grainy pictures, while Dubois muttered about how Sharon's lawyer would claim she was just desperate to help sick kids. The defense was already filing motions saying Sharon was a victim too, forced into this by poverty and medical bills. Bellamy slammed her hand on the table when she heard that and said, "No aunt does what Sharon did for money." 2 days before the grand jury hearing, I got the official paper telling me when to show up at the courthouse. My hands shook reading it, because I knew this meant telling strangers every detail about Lacey again. The morning of the hearing, I put on my only suit and drove downtown early to avoid traffic. The courthouse had metal detectors and guards who checked my ID 3 times before sending me to a waiting room. Other people sat there looking nervous too, and I wondered if they were witnesses for other cases. A woman in a gray suit came to get me and led me down a long hallway to heavy wooden doors. Inside were 23 people sitting in rows like a small classroom staring at me. The prosecutor stood at a podium asking me to state my name and job for the record. Then came 3 hours of questions about every single thing I'd noticed about Lacey over 3 months. They wanted to know exact words she'd said about the modeling and what clothes she wore on specific days. One juror asked why I didn't report it sooner, and I explained how each thing seemed weird but not criminal until that Thursday. Another asked about the items in her backpack, and I had to describe them without using graphic words. The prosecutor kept bringing me back to the pattern, how things got worse each week. When they finally let me leave, my shirt was soaked with sweat and my throat hurt from talking. The next week, the grand jury came back with their decision, and Bellamy called me right away. They'd indicted Sharon on 12 counts, including trafficking, exploitation, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. 2 of the men from the motel were also indicted, but 3 others had disappeared before arrests could be made. The FBI put them on wanted lists, and their photos went to every police department in the country. Ernest called me into his office that Friday with a different tone than before. He said the school board wanted to create a training program about recognizing abuse signs in kids. They wanted me to help design it since I'd actually spotted the problem, even if it took time to act. We spent 4 hours that afternoon writing down every warning sign I'd noticed with Lacey. Ernest typed while I talked about the different cars, the perfume, the pills, the way she'd change at exactly 3:15 every day. He said they'd make it required training for every driver in the district starting next month. Meanwhile, Rada had found special foster parents for Lacey who'd worked with trafficked kids before. These weren't regular foster parents, but people trained in trauma and recovery who knew not to ask questions. Rada called to tell me Lacey was settling in, and then mentioned she'd sent a drawing. It was a yellow school bus with stick figures inside, and one labeled Mr. Pete with a smiley face. I kept that drawing in my wallet where nobody could see me look at it sometimes. 3 weeks later, Bellamy and Dubois were arguing in his office about strategy when I came for another meeting. Sharon's lawyer was pushing for a deal where she'd testify against the bigger players in exchange for less prison time. Dubois thought it was worth it to get the people running the whole operation, but Bellamy wanted Sharon to rot in prison forever. They asked my opinion, which felt weird since I'm just a bus driver, not a lawyer. I said getting the big guys mattered, but 15 years didn't seem like enough for what Sharon did to her own niece. Dubois explained that without Sharon's testimony, they might not convict anyone else since the evidence was mostly digital. The story hit the news that weekend, and suddenly everyone knew about the bus driver who saved a kid. Reporters showed up at the bus depot wanting interviews, and my phone rang nonstop with people I hadn't talked to in years. Facebook exploded with comments about what I should have done differently and how they would have known sooner. Some people called me a hero, while others said I was an idiot for not seeing it immediately. I deleted all my social media apps and told Ernest to handle any press stuff. My neighbor left a casserole on my porch with a note saying she was proud of me, which was nice but felt weird. Sharon took the plea deal on a Tuesday morning according to Bellamy's voicemail. 15 years in federal prison if she gave up everyone involved, including names, dates, payment records, and client lists. She spent 8 hours in a room with FBI agents drawing diagrams of the whole network and explaining how they moved kids between states. Her information led to warrants in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky within 48 hours. The FBI raids happened at dawn 3 days later, with SWAT teams hitting multiple locations at once. They arrested 4 major players, including the man they called the banker, who handled all the money transfers. But several others had already fled, probably tipped off when the story went public on the news. Bellamy was mad about the leaks, but said at least they'd saved more kids and shut down 3 active operations. When I finally went back to driving my regular route, everything had changed with new safety rules. Every driver had to check in by radio every 30 minutes and confirm their location. Parents got texts when kids got on and off the bus through a new app the district bought. Emergency buttons were installed near every driver's seat that would alert police and record everything. The kids didn't know why things were different, but complained about the new rules. Parents stood at bus stops more often now and actually looked at their kids instead of their phones. I recognized the change in how they paid attention, really seeing their children instead of just going through motions. The school district called a mandatory meeting 2 weeks later, where they brought in experts to teach us about trafficking signs. The training room was packed with every driver, aide, and supervisor in the district watching videos of warning signs we'd all missed before. They showed us the same patterns I'd seen with Lacey, like kids talking about modeling jobs, bringing extra bags, changing appearance before pickup, and adults who switch cars constantly. The instructor pointed out how traffickers use family members to avoid suspicion and explained that kids often don't know their victims because they think they're helping someone they love. During a break, I heard from another driver that Lacey was in therapy 3 times times a week now and starting to understand what really happened to her. The therapist had told Rada it was a big step that Lacey stopped calling it modeling and started saying, "the bad things Aunt Sharon made me do," instead. Meanwhile, Tommy was getting real help through state programs with a medical advocate, making sure he had the right wheelchair, medications, and physical therapy he needed. The advocate found out Sharon had been pocketing most of the disability payments meant for Tommy's care, while telling Lacey they needed more money for his treatments. Detective Bellamy called me the next morning, asking if I could meet her at the station because she had updates about the investigation. I drove over during my lunch break and found her office covered in case files, photos, and charts connecting different people in the trafficking ring. She showed me how my 911 call had led to raids in 3 states that saved 14 other kids who were being trafficked the same way as Lacey. The FBI had tracked payment records showing the ring moved over $2 million in the past 3 years using cryptocurrency and cash drops at different motels. She pointed to surveillance photos from the Starlight Motel, showing the same cars appearing at different times with different kids over the past 18 months. One photo showed a girl about Lacey's age getting out of a car with the same man who'd been at room 118 that day. Bellamy said that girl was safe now, living with her grandmother in another state after being rescued in one of the raids. She thanked me again for following my gut because without that call, these kids would still be trapped. Rada stopped by the bus depot later that week with more news about Lacey's progress. She said Lacey had finally stopped asking when she could go back to work and was starting to act more like a regular kid. In therapy, Lacey was learning that real jobs don't happen in motel rooms and that adults who care about you don't make you take pills or wear certain clothes. Her therapist called it a breakthrough when Lacey drew a picture showing Sharon as a monster instead of as her helper. The Starlight Motel made the news the following week when the health department shut it down for multiple code violations. The official report listed problems with the electrical system, mold, and unsanitary conditions, but everyone knew the real reason was the ongoing criminal investigation. I drove past it one afternoon and saw boards over the windows and crime scene tape still wrapped around room 118. The community center called me about speaking at their monthly safety meeting about recognizing trafficking signs. I didn't want the attention, but figured if it helped one kid, it would be worth the discomfort. I'm really curious about how those other kids are doing after being rescued from the raids. 14 children saved because of one phone call is incredible. How did the FBI track all those cryptocurrency payments through different states like that? The room had about 40 parents and teachers who listened while I explained the specific things I'd noticed with Lacey. I told them about the schedule changes, the extra bags, the pills she called vitamins, and how she'd practice poses in my bus mirror. I explained how traffickers make kids think they're helping their families and use guilt to keep them quiet. One parent asked why I didn't report it sooner, and I admitted I'd made excuses for what I was seeing because I didn't want to believe something so horrible was happening. After the meeting, several parents came up to share their own concerns about kids they knew, and I gave them Detective Bellamy's contact information. 6 months had passed since that day at the motel, and I'd found my new normal driving a different route on the other side of town. I still watched my kids carefully, but without the paranoid feeling that something terrible was happening to all of them. The emergency button near my seat reminded me daily that I could act if I needed to, and the new check-in system meant dispatch always knew where we were. My new kids didn't know my history, and I liked it that way, just being Mr. Pete, who reminded them to sit properly and not throw things. One morning, Rada left an envelope on my windshield with my name written in purple marker. Inside was a card with 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall and one in a wheelchair, with "Thank you, Mr. Pete" written in Lacey's careful handwriting. Rada's note explained that Lacey and Tommy were in different foster homes, but saw each other every weekend and both were doing well. Tommy's foster family was working on adoption, and Lacey's foster parents were teachers who understood trauma and were helping her catch up in the school. The card went into my wallet next to the school bus drawing Lacey had made months earlier. Detective Bellamy called with final updates about the investigation, explaining that the main trafficking ring was completely dismantled, with 23 people arrested across 5 states. She warned me that these operations were like weeds that grew back quickly, but at least this specific network was gone and couldn't hurt any more kids. The FBI had identified 42 victims total, ranging from age 8 to 15, all of whom were now in protective custody or safe placements. She said my willingness to testify had been crucial because it established the timeline and pattern of abuse. Some of the smaller players had already pled guilty to avoid trial, which meant Lacey wouldn't have to testify about what happened to her. Sharon's sentencing happened on a rainy Tuesday morning at the federal courthouse downtown. She got 15 years as part of her plea deal, where she testified against 12 other defendants, including the man they called the banker who ran the financial side. The prosecutor told me Sharon's testimony had been essential for convicting the higher-ups who would have walked free without her cooperation. 3 of the men from room 118 pled guilty to avoid trial after Sharon identified them in photos and described their specific roles in the operation. The bus depot break room became my second home after work, where drivers started gathering to talk about what we were seeing on our routes. Jerry, who drove the elementary route, started noticing a girl who always had new expensive shoes, but wore the same torn jacket every day, and we helped him document everything before he called CPS. Maria spotted a boy who kept falling asleep in weird positions, and turned out his mom's boyfriend was making him stand in the corner all night as punishment. We created this informal network where we'd text each other about suspicious cars following our buses, or kids showing up with unexplained injuries. The district even brought in a specialist to train us properly after my case made the news, and suddenly every driver was paying closer attention to their kids. Rada called me one afternoon to share that Lacey had started at Jefferson Elementary across town, where nobody knew about her past. Her foster parents were both teachers who understood trauma, and they'd worked with the school to make sure Lacey could just be a regular kid without everyone treating her differently. She was joining the art club and had made 2 friends who invited her to a sleepover, which was huge progress considering she used to think sleepovers were for work. The foster mom sent Rada photos of Lacey finger painting and playing on the swings, looking like any other 10-year-old instead of the made-up doll Sharon had turned her into. Tommy's situation moved even faster when his foster family filed adoption papers after just 4 months. They were an older couple who'd raised 3 kids already and had experience with special needs children, so Tommy's wheelchair and medical appointments didn't scare them at all. The state expedited the adoption since Tommy was thriving in their care, and his new dad was a retired physical therapist who could help with his exercises every day. Rada said Tommy was getting fitted for new leg braces that actually fit properly and might even be able to walk short distances with a walker soon. Detective Bellamy got her promotion to sergeant and immediately started building a special trafficking unit with officers trained specifically to recognize the signs. She called me to say thanks because my case had given her the evidence she needed to convince the department this unit was necessary. Her team had already identified 3 other potential trafficking situations in our district, using the patterns from Lacey's case as a guide. She kept saying my one phone call had started something bigger than I'd ever know, but I just wanted kids to be safe on their way to the school. The district attorney's office finished prosecuting everyone they could find connected to the ring, and the sentences were serious. 8 people got convicted, with the shortest sentence being 10 years for one of the drivers who claimed he didn't know what was happening. The man with the camera equipment got 25 years, and the one they called the banker got life without parole after they found records of him organizing similar operations in 3 other states. Not everyone got caught since some fled when the story hit the news, but 8 convictions was better than these kids never getting justice at all. The school board called me in for what I thought was another review of my abandoned route, but instead, they gave me a commendation for my actions. The superintendent made this speech about moral courage and protecting children, but I kept thinking about how I'd watched Lacey for weeks before doing anything. They wanted to do a big ceremony, but I asked them to keep it small since I didn't want to be some hero when real heroes were the cops and social workers who actually rescued those kids. The certificate went in my desk drawer at home, where I wouldn't have to look at it and remember how close I came to not making that call. A full year passed before Rada reached out with a final update on both kids. Lacey was in therapy twice a week, but she was laughing again and had joined her school's drama club, where she could perform in age-appropriate ways. She'd stopped talking about modeling completely and was obsessed with horses, like a normal 11-year-old. Tommy had gotten the surgery he needed for his legs, and while he'd always need mobility aids, he was getting stronger every day. Both kids were in permanent homes with families who loved them and understood their histories. Rada said they still saw each other every few weeks, and Tommy would race Lacey in his new sports wheelchair while she ran alongside, cheering him on. I still drive my route every morning and afternoon, but everything feels different now. I watch the kids getting on and off, knowing any one of them could be hiding something terrible at home. The emergency button they installed by my seat gets tested every week, and dispatch has protocols now for when drivers report concerns. My new kids don't know my history, and that's fine since I'm just Mr. Pete, who reminds them to stay seated and not throw things out the windows. But I watch them all carefully and trust my gut when something seems wrong, because I learned that sometimes the rules don't matter as much as keeping kids safe. Well, that's gonna do it for me today. Appreciate you hanging out and questioning things right along with me. Always feels like a real journey when we share it together. Subscribe for more content like this.